Hello, everyone. We're going to be resuming section 2 of chapter 1 on Simone Weil from Belonging Again. II.1, and I appreciate everyone's interest in the text. You can find the book on Amazon. All reviews, comments, etc., so forth are greatly appreciated. And we will be starting with addressing gravity with grace. Again, this is following our last section on Simone Weil. This is chapter 2, section 2, well, chapter 1, section 2, 2b, addressing gravity with grace. And we will begin reading now. Being capable of thought, we must choose between responding like robots to stimuli or adapting to an inner representation of that necessity, which is formed idiosyncratically. This inner representation, Weil notes, suggests Nietzsche's will and the ability to cultivate and live according to inner resources. And that suggests an individual who is not typical and likely does not think typically. And we've been talking about how Simone Weil might be an example of minti-divergence, which is a kind of play on the neurodivergent, which is necessary for overcoming Nash equilibria, which we talked about in light of Lorenzo's work on game theory, and how collective intelligence is more likely to overcome various game theory problems like multipolar traps and so on and so forth, if you incorporate neurodiversity into the collective intelligence. And again, chapter 2 of book 1 of Belonging Again, II.1, is called Neurodiversity, Weil, and Nash Equilibria. To resume reading, if we don't turn to and cultivate inner resources, which seems to be all a prisoner has in Plato's cave, we seem very likely to end up in Nash equilibria. But at the same time, if we just turn to our inner resources and retreat there, as can be tempting, we end up isolated and the social order dissolves. This is the tension Belonging Again explores constantly, and it is the risk of deluse, even if deluse is ultimately necessary, the cheap deluse versus costly deluse. We need to cultivate minti-divergence without at the same time ending up cut off and isolated from the other. How might we accomplish this paradoxical goal? For Weil, we must learn attention, an act I think we can associate with Martin Buber's I-Thou, which Javier Rivera will speak on, and an act that is not typical. To engage in attention, a key phrase for Weil, we must be different. Although people seem to be unaware of it today, Simone Weil wrote, the development of the faculty of attention forms the real object. The work of O.G. Rose stresses conditionalism, and Weil recognized attention as the greatest force of conditioning. We are what we love, Dr. James K. Smith tells us, and what we love, which forms our habits and character, is relative to our attention. Attention is an effort, the greatest of all efforts, perhaps, but it is a negative effort, which is to say it involves clearing, Heidegger, and working on ourselves inwardly more than something external or in the world. John, good to see you, and I appreciate it. That's very kind of you. To quote Weil extensively, attention consists of suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. It means holding in our minds within reach of that thought, but on a lower level and not in contact with the diverse knowledge we have acquired, which we are forced to make use of. Our thoughts should be in relation to all particular and already formulated thoughts, as a man on a mountain who, as he looks forward, sees also below him, without actually looking at them, a great many forests and plains. Above all, our thoughts should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that is to penetrate it. And I do like that image from Weil on this idea of when you're at the top of a mountain, kind of overlooking everything. You see a lot precisely because you're not overly focused on one thing. It's kind of this posture of pulled in, this posture of this place where you can receive, which we will associate with Ivan Illich's prepared versus planning. And I appreciated John. So to resume reading, the language of valley makes me think of Heidegger's notion of death as a range of mountains bordering being. as discussed by Dr. Niebenhauser at the Halcon Guild. And we can almost see attention as an act of dying to self in that very passivity, that very openness on the top of the mountain range, which is emphasized in Christianity. In this death, we are open to the other, and through our gaze, engage in becoming other, which is Hegel, AB, which is to say that attention can entail the absolute choice. In Sartre, the gaze is hell, but in Weil, we see attention as life. In some Christian thought, God is both heaven to those who love him and hell to those who don't. So perhaps eyes are something similar. They are either Sartre's hellish gaze or Weil's heavenly attention. We are always dealing with doubles and risks. There's something about Weil that is Heideggerian, for her doctrine of attention aligns with what I consider Heidegger's clearing, as I've discussed with Andrew Luber, some lovely topics on that, conversations about that. Or annihilation, as Thomas Wynne teaches on, in a very life free of worldly and technical concerns, suggests that indeed an experience of being as being, or what we experience as such, can go a long way to saving us from the thinking, which reduces the world to standing reserve and us into cogs in a globalized machine. Now, perhaps this can actually be a problem, as perhaps Weil suggests, through the extremity of her life, but at the same time, there might be no other way for us to avoid the Nash equilibria, which define the meta-crisis, than for us to have, for us to be so extreme in the way that Weil describes. Such extremity might be the only way to avoid capture. It might be the only way to ultimately prove imperceptible, which Deleuze encourages, as it might be the only way to stay free. For Concerning Epistemology, which is a paper by O.G. Rose, does suggest that freedom is non-rational. There's always reason to worry, and that's why it creates a kind of self-enclosure. But that paper is in Second Thoughts. To resume, Weil was ruthless in her deconstruction of anything she believed would threaten her ability to exercise attention. She never allowed herself to think of a future state, but she always believed that the instant of death is the center and object of life. This brings to mind Hegel's insistence that we should not think the future, as it also brings to mind Heidegger and his emphasis on death in his thinking. Even Christ himself could be a threat to attention. As Weil wrote, Christ likes us to prefer truth to him because before being Christ, he is truth. If one turns aside from him to go toward truth, one will not go far before falling into his arms. Weil was even critical of human rights because he worried that it reduced morality to a legal transaction. It is neither his prison nor the human personality in him which is sacred to me. It is he, that radical thou. Weil writes, which is to say, it is not because he has the right that I respect him, but because of the whole of him. If this is forgotten, attention will decline, and Weil saw human rights as potentially contributing to this error. To set up as a standard of public morality a notion which can neither be defined nor convinced is to open the door to every kind of tyranny. Lastly, we should note how Weil emphasized that the Germans had a massive advantage in the war, this being World War II, because they had the inestimably valuable psychological advantage of progressing toward an objective, while the French and Allied troops could only feel they were guarding the status quo. In my view, this also suggests Weil's radical insistence that attention was everything and worth sacrifice to cultivate. The Germans were winning the war because they had something which focused their attention on winning and the world which would emerge thanks to that winning. Without this, Weil worried that the Allies were doomed. Furthermore, Weil even attacked the Marxism she once supported, coming to see the revolution as the opiate of the people, in that it made people believe that the working class had the attention needed to rise up and change the economic systems, but this was not the case. Habituated, structured, and flattened by capital, a spiritual revolution would be necessary if that attention were to prove possible. And on this point, we might look ahead toward Ivan Illich, who suggested that discourse and the system focused our attention only on it, and discourse we're thinking Kafka, giving it great power and control over our lives. a dictator can control us by simply assuring we never take our eyes off of him. And Tony, good to see you. Attention takes into account a strange but central reality. Well, thank you, John. To resume, you do not interest me. This is Simone. No man can say these words to another without committing a cruelty and offending justice. Your person does not interest me. These words can be used in an affectionate conversation between close friends without jarring upon even the tenderest nerve. In the same way, one can say without degrading oneself, my person does not count, but not I do not count. We do not care about persons. We care about a radical you, the thou Martin Buber discusses. And I think this point, just some commentary, it's like the difference between is and suchness and David Hume. You know, the reason why David Hume wants to deconstruct from is to ought is precisely so that we base our ought and ethics on a radical suchness. Weird Salinsky, good to see you. Pleasure. When David Hume deconstructs the divide between is and ought, it's precisely so that our ethics is based on a radical encounter of suchness. And I think when Simone Weil is talking about the difference between the I and person, it's a very similar point. Like if I were to say, my person does not count, that strikes us different from I do not count. And so getting at that radical particularity, the face, you know, of Levinas that Dave and brings up, that's so important, that actually things like human rights, as odd as it sounds, can kind of function as a totality to keep us from encountering the other, the suchness of the other, these philosophical abstractions that David Hume was concerned in the name of enlightenment was actually removing us from the very ground required so that our philosophical work had any anchoring and meaning at all, actually. So I think we can certainly associate Simone Weil with David Hume, the I ought problem that David Hume brings to our attention to make a clearing, we could even say, for ought and suchness. To resume reading. We, in a similar way, do not care about human rights. We care about whole persons. This is hard to understand or explain, precisely because it is irreducible and can only be experienced. But the distinction is paramount and suggests why we must encounter the whole of the other in their particular story, and never will it suffice to encounter abstractions, which of course, to talk about doing that is in itself an abstraction. Like right now, talking about is an abstraction. So it's very odd. There always has to be this dashing out of abstractions which help you approach the other. As it helps you approach the other, it's as if it has to annihilate itself along the way and then push you further ahead. Which again, I think, you know, Derrida said that Heidegger once had being with a dash through it, and that was really getting at what being was. And I think all abstractions kind of have to have a dash through them if they're actually going to help us get at concrete beings. But of course, a signifier with a dash through it might not have the authority or be taken with the seriousness to so compel us. So you have to draw the dash, in a sense, as you're pushed along. As you're brought along, then you dash it out. If you do it too early, it may lose the authority to compel you. But if you don't do it at all, the abstraction can stand in from the particularity. So there's a certain gradual unveiling, a gradual process there, which makes me think of Dante and Beatrice. And we talked about that at the Philosophy Portal Conference, the con that can be found on the website. To resume, unless, that is, the system trains us in disabling professions, as Ivan Illich discussed, and we are habituated by discourse to the place where we can't tell the difference between a whole person and a disabled person, humanizing work and dehumanizing work, which might be our current fate. And, you know, by that, it's kind of the idea of the whole social order is kind of structured in a way that makes us unable to tell the difference between abstraction and concrete, disables us from the ability of attention. Then we can't tell the difference between the concrete other and maybe the big other, to use language from Theory Underground. We can't tell the difference between the face and the totality, the infinity and the totality. Yes, Tony, disable. And I'm thinking Ivan Illich here, kind of looking ahead when we talk about disabling professions that Ivan Illich is going to get into, on the idea that the modern, we move in prosperity from subsistence society to very expert dependent societies where we're no longer, say, able to light a fire. We have to get help, or we can't build our own house. We got to get experts to build our own house. And as a result, we're disabled from that ability, but we don't tend to notice because then we're specialized in an ability to get paid for, and wages stand in to make us not notice the loss of skill. And something that we're kind of suggesting here is we may have been disabled from the ability to have attention, to like focus, to have attention on the other. But we don't notice. I mean, a way to put it, like if the algorithms and dopamine and all that have destroyed our focus and attention, then we also don't have the attention to know we don't have attention. Like, you don't notice the loss of attention. That's kind of the irony. Like, if you lose the ability, and this is something I think Weil was really big on, is that if you lose the ability to have attention, you also lose the ability to know you have attention. And that's where you get for her the affliction, this enclosure structure. And throughout Belonging, again, a lot of the book is about this problem of various ways consciousness and the subject themselves enclose themselves, and how in a way we try to create belonging in a false sense, in a self-effacing way, by creating structures of enclosure, versus finding belonging again in an actual human connection and relationship or Leibniz situation. So, that's why that idea of AA logic is always self-enclosing, whereas AB logic has a certain incompleteness that is open to the other. So, disabling work and I think Simone Weil can go together. To resume, the Greeks, and this is Simone Weil, the Greeks had no conception of rights. They were content with the name of justice. For Weil, rights can block attention and keep us from experiencing the whole person, which can lead to a death of the very human subject we claim that we seek to help. Oh, and that's very kind of you, Tony. And thank you. Goodness. The notion of rights, and I'd love to hear what you think of the book, and no hurry at all, absolutely. But thank you, Tony. The notion of rights, by its very mediocrity, leads to human degradation. No thou was ever witnessed in the name rights. So there's this funny way in which what Weil is saying is there's something very empty and kind of mediocre about philosophical notions like right. And again, it is like David Hume talking about philosophy. He's critiquing philosophy being its own grounding, but because there's a certain mediocrity to the idea of justice versus the face of the other of justice. And I think that like there's a certain flatness to the idea of the other versus the face of the other. And so that, that's kind of what he's getting at. Rights are abstractions, like what technology in a system can reduce us to for Illich. And that is the fundamental problem. But rationality and thinking are in the business of generating abstractions, which means our very minds are a threat to attention. And yet the abstraction of human rights is generated precisely to protect and honor people. Rationality presents its abstractions as to our benefit, and indeed, when we think about them, we are rational to conclude they are beneficial. How would the world organize itself if we didn't have human rights? How could we function without something quantifiable and universalizable? What would be the scaffolding which held together the world? Indeed, Weil seems to be suggesting that removing law could help the world function better, but removing law also seems like it would doom us, wouldn't it? Well, if everyone was neurotypical, probably, but if we were all menti-divergent, that could lead to social fragmentation. If everyone was that, you could have the delusion problem. Here, we can see again why a dialectic between the external and the internal is needed, AB, but dialectics are not natural, not in this way. They emerge from conditioning, but the very thought that we need conditioning is not natural. And as is a big thrust in Belonging again, many of the problems we find ourselves in are a consequence of ironic. There's an irony where we do, X does Y for Z, and Y is precisely why X doesn't get Z. Likewise, in the name of protecting human beings, we create human rights, which then turn human beings into abstractions, which then disable our ability to recognize human beings. And I think irony as a causal mechanism is very, very important because I think most of these kind of deep enclosure problems of human beings are due to irony, where we use a good thing in a misordered way, which leads to unintentional consequences that create enclosures. Like, again, the phenomenology of an idea is it's very hard to have an idea of a cat and not in the experience of that idea kind of be torted as if it was equivalent to the particular actual thing. Like it is like the very act of thinking makes one tend to confuse ideas with experiences, which is very odd, but that is an unavoidable problem or risk that comes with thinking. And if you don't know that, and you just get in the habit of thinking and not paying attention to that, it's easy to engage in that confusion and never realize that you're doing so. And that's when the irony begins to occur. And contradiction, irony, paradox, those things definitely go together. Solinsky. And actually, that's interesting. The disabling seems to push nostalgia in that attention loses, loss leaves only memory. I think there's something I think that's true. I think there is some in Plato, and Jockin will talk about this. There's some very interesting differences between memory that has this kind of grasping of this philosophical insight, like you see in Menno, and then you have the nostalgia bias where you're trying to get back to the past. Like there's differences, it's like between recollecting and remembering, where there's some way in which in Menno you're recollecting the present in light of the past in order to be open to the future versus trying to escape the present moment. There's Bergson, Plato, there's some deep notions, and attention, I think, for Simone Weil would much more be tied to a capacity to see the present moment participating, seeing how it is participating in the forms that you have a memory of, these patterns that you've seen, and you're able to remember. Like in a funny way, without memory, you can't identify patterns, right? And certainly if you can't identify patterns, you can't even begin to approach something like a form in the way Plato means. And Simone Weil likes Plato quite a lot. But you're paying attention in order to see the past playing out again in a recurring pattern, you could almost say. So that's very, very different. That's very, very different from, say, ignoring, not looking for the past, but longing, not looking for patterns, but longing for the past. I think there's a difference there, as opposed to, there's a difference between nostalgia in this problematic way and the acknowledgement and attention to patterns, you could even say. And I think that's quite powerful. So I think that's getting at a lot. So I like that. To resume reading. Weil is not encouraging a removal of law. She is encouraging us not to believe that law is enough. She is encouraging us not to believe the law is enough, for the low order to be in the high order versus replace it. And that's a distinction from a paper, Experiencing Thinking by O.G. Rose. The problem is that where there is law, there is a tendency to outsource our compassion so that law, to that law, and conclude we do not need attention. So we outsource it to law and then say, oh, well, we don't need attention because law is doing it for us. So there's a certain outsourcing. And Illich understood this as well. For we are indeed giving attention and observing law. This is not the case, but it is easy to conflate treating people legally with treating people with attention, as it is easy to feel that the thought of X is equivalent to X. Abstractions have a tendency to overreach and position themselves as equivalent to the concrete, and if we're not paying attention, this mistake seems inevitable. A notion explored in terms of suchness regarding human, the such lacks solution to the is-ought problem. If this mistake is made, we seem destined for affliction, and locking ourselves inside something that's exit we'll forget is unlocked. And the usual, good to see you. Weil considered Plato her master, and in Geometry, Astronomy, and Platonic Forms as ordering principles by O.G. Rose, It was discussed on how we should consider forms not so much as perfections, but like orbits around which planets circle. No foundation or ground is needed to hold up the moon. It is held up in its very orbit. A dancer is not bound by anything solid or observable into following certain steps in a corresponding logic, and yet to watch a dancer can be to behold something that seems fitting and like it could have been no other way. The organizing principle of forms is like this, and when we discuss human form, we are not discussing so much the perfect human, though that notion can be part of the conversation, but more so the invisible trajectory according to which humans form and best formulate, say, A-B logic of Hegel. For Weil, attention is like an orbit in dance. It leads to social action and organization that utterly changes us and our world. Attention leads to formulation, free from the affliction we otherwise couldn't think, and that's formulation with the hyphen between form and ulation. To escape our own attention, attention formulates the neurotypical toward the neurodivergent. It non-rationally frees us of Nash equilibrium without us having to think about it, because you're bringing it to the realm of attention. Attention gives rise to emergences of immoral behavior without the scaffolding of law. Indeed, the scaffolding can be there, and in fact could be there, but the scaffolding is not the same as the dance. Law is not form. However much law might be necessary to help provide a social space in which dancing can occur, it can help fill the distance between those who do not know the same dance per se. But if we can enter into a formulating dance of attention, we are like a planet and held up in our orbit. The scaffolding is not needed, and indeed we find a way to organize ourselves in the occurring relationship through a call and response between those in the dance. We meet them in their suchness versus our abstract notion of their isness, and so ethical behavior becomes possible. We formulate their concrete. That's funny, John. In attention, we give ourselves. That is funny. In attention, we give ourselves to the other, and this is utterly necessary where sociological givens are gone. We could all learn to so give ourselves, then perhaps the loss, if we could all learn to so give ourselves, then perhaps the loss of givens could prove beneficial to humanity, a challenge which gave us an opportunity to rise to a great possibility. But isn't this idealistic? How probable is it that everyone could engage in attention, escape affliction, and formulate and organize themselves emergently through attention? Perhaps it is very unlikely, but this seems to be what a community of absolute knowing must accomplish. If it is not possible, which is the spreading of childhood in the Nietzschean sense, it seems unlikely for the majority to avoid neurotypical thinking and thus avoid Nash equilibria. The meta-crisis will worsen. Attention holds us up. It is a giving that can replace givens while also helping us avoid affliction and invisible maps. And givens is again language based on Philip Reef, which we discussed in Belonging Again, Part 1. We never erase maps entirely, no, but we can hold them differently and more openly so that we can make space for the other. Attention can change the world, for the world is under affliction, and attention is to check the unlocked door. But this is not neurotypical, and the act is ultimately non-rational, which means our brains will not easily let us carry out this simple acts. They wrote on roots. He also wrote on roots and our desperate need for them. But what can we do in a pluralistic and globalized world where givens are deconstructed and roots seem impossible? They claim that the loss of the past was equivalent of the loss of the supernatural. And so without roots, we are stuck with the horizon of the world, AA, which can mean we are stuck in affliction. A ground is no longer possible, but this means we require an orbit where givens are gone. We need giving. And please note that a cipher, a hip-hop cipher, orbits around an apophatic space, a notion which will reemerge later. Bernard Hankins, a dear friend, has a lovely TED talk on cipher mentality. I suggest, which gets at many of those ideas. To resume, a world of neurotypical AA logic will likely not succeed in this transition, and we certainly won't see a reason to make this transition unless we take seriously the lessons of Hegel, who supports AB logic. Affliction is AA inside, while attention is AB inside outside, and for Weil, attention aligns with the Eucharist, for we identify with something other than ourselves in things. As the Eucharist entails transubstantiation, like perhaps Hegel's spirit is a bone, to deeply identify with the other through attention is for us to align ourselves with others. Other, with I would associate with the absolute choice. And in this opening up an entirely different onto-epistemology of AB, neurodivergent and menti-divergent, helps us avoid Nash equilibria and the meta-crisis. If we cannot escape in this practice, if we cannot engage in this practice, we will likely not escape affliction, AA. We will likely never leave Plato's cave on our own. All right. But why do we end up in affliction in the first place? How do we end up in Plato's cave? That's a profound question and requires examining both the tendencies of rationality and non-rationality into becoming autonomous, which requires the truism of the rational trilogy to elaborate on. Later in the book, we will discuss discourse and rhetoric to answer this question. But here, let us touch on something Weil wrote. A consciousness of the various obligations always proceeds from a desire for good which is unique, unchanging, and identical with itself for every man, from the cradle to grave. This desire, perpetually stirring in the depths of our being, makes it impossible for us ever to resign ourselves to situations in which obligations are incompatible with one another. We cannot stand for our values and notions to conflict, and yet all otherness requires such a conflict, which means we are primed to avoid the other. We are primed to avoid AB for AA. If we feel pulled in too many directions, we are paralyzed with uncertainty and possibility. We are mentally overwhelmed. To escape the resulting anxiety, we can find ways to discount the other without doing so directly. For if we were direct, we would have to see ourselves as discounting others, which would put us in a bad light. But without otherness, we are prone to fall into a system of self-relating and self-justifying logic, AA, which means we're vulnerable to falling into affliction, and indeed, that is what readily occurs. When we experience tension, anxiety, uncertainty, and the like, we must decide what these feelings mean and how we should respond. We are naturally led to believe that a feeling of anxiety is evidence that we need to change course, back away, withdraw, and so on. And indeed, that all follows from an AA framework. This is why adapting an AB framework is critical, for otherwise we lack the resources needed to interpret anxiety and tension as perhaps evidence that we are going in the right direction. If anxiety is needed for us to escape affliction through paying attention to the other, then an AA framework would have us withdraw from the very experience that could help us escape affliction. Worse yet, as we lock ourselves inside affliction, we might believe we are escaping it. We are all prone to solipolism. I can never say that word. This tendency to think that we're the only person who exists. SOLIPSISM, solipolism, something like that. I do say indeed a lot. So we are all prone to treating ourselves as the only I that exists. The belief that we are the only mind which exists, for the brain wants to practically believe this, regardless what we want. If the brain is all that exists, it is safe and doesn't have to use as much energy. After all, there isn't an external world which the brain has to worry about. All the brain must do is survive. This desire for solipolism might exist forever in conflict with our bodily desire for love and relationship, and yet we need the brain to love. Thus, the brain is a frenemy. And of course, the brain also can't explicitly assert or suggest that it wants to be all that exists, and so it engages in subtle mental gymnastics to practically indirectly believe this without technically directly believing this, suggesting that the brain is always in the business for its own convenience of moving us into affliction. Avoiding the subtle way our brains direct us will not be easy, and in fact, though it often seems like philosophy is meaningless and has no purpose other than perhaps boosting human pride and making us feel better through therapeutic understanding, the very reality of affliction is why philosophy is needed. If thought naturally traps us in AA, in self-enclosure and self-effacement and so on and so on, then we require thought which can think differently from typical thought. And that is what philosophy makes possible. We ignore it for good reason at our own peril, perhaps suggesting that the very engagement with philosophy requires for us to overcome a rational impasse. Such as in the Net 20, elsewhere in O.G. Rose is discussed the topic of self-forgetfulness, inspired by Timothy Keller, which attempts to navigate a space between selfishness and selflessness by emphasizing the need to simply forget ourselves and just use ourselves like a thumb. In my opinion, focusing on the self is how we can readily end up in affliction, AA, whereas if we live paying attention, we can find ourselves engaged in self-forgetfulness, focused on the other, AB. Where there is attention, there is self-forgetfulness, which can be a state in which we forget that we think the door of affliction is locked, and thus we try to open it and find ourselves walking outside without thinking about it. In fact, given how thought naturally structures reality toward us, AA, it seems as if the only hope we have to escape affliction is indeed through a state of not thinking. And yet there is a fine line between thoughtlessness, which is precisely what occurs in affliction and can lead to the banality of evil of Hannah Arendt, and the cessation of thought, which occurs in self-forgetfulness, a negation, sublation. The problem and solutions are also similar, suggesting why philosophy has a critical role to tell apart these fine distinction, suggesting a need for skill and attention toward our very minds. Attention entails a state of self-forgetfulness in favor of the other, and in this we practically move from AA to AB. Ultimately, AB is closer to the absolute than AA, though AB includes AA. AA doesn't necessarily include AB. And for Weil, we can assume that attention is possible for anyone, suggesting hope for everyone in Plato's cave, as we can infer from her beautiful reflection. And this is Weil, quoting Weil. Any human being, even though practically devoid of natural faculties, can penetrate to the kingdom of truth reserved for genius, if only he longs for truth perpetually, if only he who longs for truth perpetually concentrates all his attention upon its attainment. The misery of human society can be summed up for Weil in the notion that we have created and let ourselves be carried into worlds of affliction. We are yet to make worlds of attention. In this, we can see Weil suggesting that societies of givens might tend toward affliction, similar to how givens lead to the banality of evil, discussed in Hannah Arendt. If givens are done for or radically reduced, might this be an opportunity for societies of giving instead? Could giving be the new given, per se? Would this be a move from a world that is basically autonomously neurotypical to a world that is more neurodivergent and menti-divergent? Attention for Weil is far more important than will. And yet how Nietzsche understands will seems paramount. It seems to me that we are to be Nietzscheans toward ourselves and more like Weil and Martin Buber to others. Will is our own orientation to us, while attention is our orientation to otherness. In this, we find a Hegelian dialectic, which consists of the work we must do so that we can enter into the stories of others, story democracy, as I've spoken with Andrew Luber about, and find support for ourselves in this world without givens, orbits like forms and ciphers. Our attention to others holds us up with them, as our will to ourselves keeps us intrinsically motivated. The attention keeps us out of conflict and misunderstanding and even thrilled to enter different stories, while the will keeps us going. Attention to others means we are self-forgetful to let their stories surround us like something worth losing ourselves in. Other flow, we might say. Weil speaks of grace and gravity and tells us that the natural movements of the soul are controlled by laws analogous to those of physical gravity. For me, this suggests that souls naturally seek givens and want to be supported by givens. And when they are gone, the soul naturally falls into despair, pushed down by gravity. If the soul is not to so descend, it must act unnaturally. And that would entail absolute knowing, or the childlikeness of Nietzsche. We must always expect things to happen in conformity with the laws of gravity unless there is supernatural intervention. How can we act unnaturally? Weil tells Christians to pray with the thought that God does not exist. The absolute knower believes absolute knowing is unobtainable. The children of Nietzsche do not believe Nietzsche has been created yet. God can only be present in creation under the form of an absence. This world is the closed door, it is a barrier, and at the same time, it is the way through. Weil tells us that God gave me being in order that I should give it back to him. Likewise, perhaps we have will by otherness so that we can give it back through self-forgetful attention to others. Weil discusses the impersonal and the anonymous as where we can find truth and beauty. And though there is a sense in which this is true, I would note that this realm requires self-forgetfulness and conditionalism. So we should not mistake Weil as encouraging encouraging us to ignore the subject or believe we can avoid it. The impersonal is known only through the person, and thus the person must work hard. Weil writes, the human being can only escape from the collective by raising himself above the personal and entering the impersonal. The moment he does this, there is something in him, a small portion of his soul upon which nothing of the collective can give a hold. Yeah, I like that, Salisky. Yeah, very nice. Society should be arranged with the sole purpose of removing whatever is detrimental to the growth and mysterious germination of the impersonal element of the soul, which for me suggests a society focused on cultivating and spreading self-forgetfulness, childhood, and rhetoric, as we'll later explain in light of Dietrich McCloskey. This suggests a society focused on ending affliction, which is a society that keeps force and rationality from directing people into situations where what is rational is what is detrimental, whether this be a Nash equilibria, working a job which requires thoughtlessness, or so on. If Lorenzo is correct that social Nash equilibria and rational impasses require neurodivergence to avoid, then society should be in the business of incorporating neurodivergence and menti-divergence into its collective consciousness and operations. Otherwise, a matter of affliction, the meta-crisis might prove insurmountable. Whereas gravity is the work of creation, the work of grace consists of decreating us, which here we can use Weil's words to suggest that rationality is in the work of building society into Nash equilibria, for good reason. Whereas non-rationality and neurodivergence work to pull society away from building itself into what it will lack itself inside, what it will lock itself inside. After her time of experiencing affliction, Weil's belief in Marxist revolution disappeared completely. Not religion, but revolutions, he said, was the opiate of the people. Revolution, organized and operated according to rationality, would not free us from Nash equilibria, and yet belief that it might pacify us into putting all our faith in revolution, which meant we would never engage in the spiritual change of attention, which they believed was necessary. Similarly, if we believe that we can evolve consciousness or increase rationality, we have little incentive to look for a new kind of thinking outside the neurotypical, meaning we will be in the business of degrees of rationality versus non-rationality. To engage in neurodivergence and menti-divergence would be to engage in something distinct, like the spiritual in Weil, but it is supernatural to die for something weak in the eyes of society. as which would be an opportunity for non-rationality. To die and sacrifice ourselves for the neurotypical is natural, but to embrace at our possible expense the neurodivergent is unnatural. It requires madness or bravery, and arguably the neurotypical would be incapable of this, hence why the neurodivergent are so necessary, exactly as Lorenzo teaches on game theory dynamics. Again, to emphasize, I do not know if Simone Weil was neurodivergent, but she at least practically seems that way. She was arguably suprahuman, but can we say she had an evolved personality? Simone was a genius, but can we say her life was a product of being amazingly rational? Albert Camus was a genius, as was Jean-Paul Sartre, and yet Simone Weil seems to have had something else about her that was greater than intellect. She simply lived differently. She could stand up in Plato's cave and leave on her own. Under affliction, the other prisoners would have laughed. Typical. Simone Weil represents neurodivergence for me, and when I think of what characterizes an absolute knower, Deleuzian individual, or Nietzschean child, it strikes me as having far more to do with something akin to neurodivergence than it does intelligence. I'm not saying it is equivalent technically, but there seems to be practical overlaps that need to be taken into consideration. Indeed, if what is needed to address the problems outlined in Belonging Again requires something closer to neurodivergence than it does evolved consciousness or greater rationality, then we need to emphasize neurodivergence and what Cadell Lass refers to as alienness. The language used across the internet that suggests otherwise might contribute to the problem. Here, we should note something Simone believed. More genius is needed than was needed by Archimedes to invent mechanics and physics. A new saintliness is a still more marvelous invention. Rationality and philosophy certainly have a role, just not an autonomous one. And I also agree with Weil's sentiment. We need a world full of communities of absolute knowing, but how to bring that about is not self-evident. In fact, if it was self-evident, it would likely be an expression of affliction and AA thinking. To see difficulty in the task suggests the task is rightly seen. But it is not seen easily, and often it feels like we only ever catch glances of it that are gone just as quickly as we notice them. And yet we must keep trying, for we are always at risk of ending up in affliction and indestructible maps, and we will end up in those if we cease being vigilant. Attention is a practice that can bring us into menti-divergence, as seems to be needed so that we take Nietzsche's will seriously and exercise the intrinsic motivation which is required so that we might leave Plato's cave on our own. Furthermore, menti-divergence seems to be what we practice if we are self-forgetful, which emerges in attention, and in attention we see the possibility of sociological giving, AB, to make up the loss of sociological givens, AA. This is a key notion, which is inherently far more intersuppositional than presuppositional, as discussed in the Absolute Choice, and it suggests the need for us to discuss differences between gifts, givens, giving, and the like, and it seems that a community of absolute knowing is a community of sociological giving, and hence openness. But what does this mean? That is the question. And the answer is not something that will come naturally or typically. Fortunately, we have Weil's life and example to help us think anew. As I've spoken to layman Pascal about, Gurdjieff seems to have been an example like Simone Weil of a life which is more menti-divergent and able to move beyond affliction. I am no expert on Gurdjieff like Layman or Luke, so I cannot speak on him, but Gurdjieff could be seen as a teacher who might also help us make our experience more nutritious, which is a phrase Layman uses that I like, and thus capable of attention. If so, we might speak of a Gurdjieffian subject in a way similar to Nietzsche's child, and I might pick up on this notion in Reconstructing A is A, which is the third book of the trilogy of the Truest and the Rational. But here I wanted at least to note the potential relevance of Gurdjieff before moving on. And that is the end of chapter 2, Belonging Again, II.1. Chapter 3 is called Plans of Affliction or Preparation for Singularity. We'll talk about Cadell Last's work, Systems and Subjects, his notions on the technological singularity, which I think are very important. And it will also bring us into a key distinction between planning, and preparing in Ivan Illich. And it is indeed the usual that giving seems like a higher bar. It is. And I appreciate you, John, being here and listening. I appreciate it. And we've been talking in chapter 2 on Simone Weil as an example of multi-divergence thinking, which is not simply more rational, but it includes a dialectic between rational and non-rational, which Lorenzo does tremendous work to show that to overcome various game theory problems, one requires that neurodivergence. It won't simply do to be more rational. One can think the beautiful mind. We're thinking John Nash, things like that. And it requires moving into something like a Simone Weil, which I think, again, we can associate. We can even talk Gurdjieff, and I had a conversation with Layman Pascal, and bringing it into the ability to think a way to avoid multipolar traps, and ergo the meta crisis, as some people say. Simone Weil, yeah, that's it. You're very kind, Tony, and I appreciate it. And thank you, Solinsky. I appreciate it very much. Simone Weil, Gravity and Grace. And again, I think her life is an example, and she is also, for me, a model of thinking that we can align with what I call the modern counter-enlightenment, the counter-enlightenment in general. Again, some people don't like the language of counter-enlightenment, I understand, but if we get that there's an enlightenment, counter-enlightenment, then that very dialectic can kind of shatter the frame, and that's perfectly, that's fine with me. I have no issue with that. But for me, the modern counter-enlightenment is a critique of modernity that does not assume Kantian metaphysics, as I think much post-modernity does as a critique of modernity, and that's kind of a key distinction. And I think someone like Simone Weil is very similar in that regard. And so I think she can kind of help us start thinking the question, or offer a kind of subjectivity that can help us deal with this problem of leaving Plato's cave on our own, which opens Belonging Again II.1. That is kind of the opening of our consideration and moving forward. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram. You can find our books on Amazon. And thank you so much, Tony. Appreciate it. Thank you, John. So let's say thank you, everyone, for being here. The usual. I really appreciate it. There is a playlist on YouTube of Belonging Again II.1, the sections, the readings, and so on and so forth. We also just released Under the Wing, which is a short story collection. Michelle and I would greatly appreciate all thoughts, or anyone interested in that book would be really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, John. Usual. Thank you all, and may you all have a good night. Appreciate it. Thank you all. All the best.